Canada is often seen as quiet, peaceful, and familiar. But its history is far older, and far more complex, than many people realize. Long before modern borders existed, indigenous civilizations had already built diverse societies across the continent. Centuries before Columbus reached the Americas, Norse explorers established a settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows. Then came the Age of Empires. French explorers moved through the St. Lawrence River, while Britain and France fought for control of a continent. Out of those conflicts emerged a country shaped by compromise, expansion, immigration, and enormous geographic challenges. Canada would go on to fight in 2 world wars, expand across the north, and gradually redefine itself through bilingualism, multiculturalism, and evolving national identity. But many of its most important stories are rarely talked about. Because beneath the image of a calm modern nation is a history of exploration, conflict, survival, and transformation stretching back more than 1,000 years. Canada's name has indigenous origins. The word Canada did not originally describe a massive country stretching across North America. It came from the St. Lawrence Iroquoian word Canada, meaning village or settlement. In the 1530s, French explorer Jacques Cartier heard local inhabitants use the term while referring to the area around present-day Quebec City. Cartier began using the word to describe not just the village itself, but the surrounding territory along the St. Lawrence River. Over time, European maps gradually expanded the label Canada farther and farther across the region. So the name Canada began not as the title of a vast nation, but as a small indigenous word for a single settlement along a river. Vikings reached Canada before Columbus. European explorers reached parts of North America centuries before Christopher Columbus ever crossed the Atlantic. Around the year 1000, Norse seafarers from Greenland, often associated with the voyages of Leif Erikson, sailed westward and established a settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in present-day Newfoundland. Archaeological discoveries at the site revealed the remains of Norse-style buildings, ironworking evidence, and artifacts linked directly to Viking culture. The settlement appears to have been relatively short-lived, likely serving as a small exploration and repair base rather than a large permanent colony. For centuries, stories of Viking voyages survived mainly through Norse sagas. But modern archaeology confirmed that those stories were rooted in reality. Long before the Great Age of European empires, Norse sailors had already reached the shores of what is now Canada. France once controlled huge parts of Canada. Long before Canada became a British dominion, vast parts of North America were claimed by France. Beginning in the 16th and 17th centuries, French explorers traveled along the St. Lawrence River, through the Great Lakes, and deep into the interior of the continent. Over time, these territories became known as New France. At its height, New France stretched across an enormous area. The colony was heavily shaped by the fur trade and by relationships with indigenous nations. But control of North America became part of a larger struggle between European empires. During the 7 Years' War, Britain defeated France in key battles, including the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in 1759. Soon afterward, France ceded most of its North American territories to Britain under the Treaty of Paris in 1763. So while modern Canada is often associated with British history, much of its early foundation was once part of a sprawling French colonial world stretching across the continent. Quebec was captured in a defining battle. In 1759, a single battle helped reshape the future of North America. British forces launched an attack against the French stronghold of Quebec City. The decisive confrontation took place on the Plains of Abraham. British troops under General James Wolfe faced French forces led by General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm. Both commanders were mortally wounded during the fighting. But the British victory forced the eventual surrender of Quebec City and weakened France's hold over its North American territories. A few years later, the Treaty of Paris in 1763 formally transferred most of New France to British control. The battle did not erase French culture from Canada, far from it. But politically, the outcome marked a turning point. What happened on those plains in 1759 helped shift Canada from a French colonial world to one increasingly shaped by the British Empire. Canada didn't become independent all at once. Unlike many countries that emerged through a single revolution or declaration, Canada's independence happened gradually, over generations. In 1867, the British North America Act united several colonies into the Dominion of Canada, creating a self-governing federation within the British Empire. But Canada was not fully sovereign at that point. Britain still controlled major areas of foreign policy and constitutional authority. Over the following decades, Canada slowly gained greater independence through political negotiation rather than violent separation. Participation in World War I strengthened Canada's international identity. While the 1931 Statute of Westminster granted greater legislative autonomy to Britain's dominions. Even then, some constitutional powers remained tied to Britain until 1982. When the Constitution Act formally patriated Canada's constitution and gave the country full legal control over constitutional amendments. So Canada's path to sovereignty was not a single dramatic break. It was a slow transformation, from colony to dominion, to fully independent nation, shaped over more than a century of political evolution. The country was formed in 1867. Canada's modern political story begins with a union, not a revolution. On July 1, 1867, the British North America Act brought together several British colonies into a single federation called the Dominion of Canada. This moment, known as Confederation, created a new political structure. The system was built gradually through negotiation, compromise, and the need for economic and political stability. Over time, more provinces and territories joined, expanding the federation across the continent and shaping the geographic outline of modern Canada. But in 1867, it was something more modest. Not a fully independent nation yet, but the foundation of one. A starting point that would slowly evolve into the Canada we know today. It's the second largest country on Earth. Canada is one of the largest nations ever mapped, yet much of its landscape remains thinly populated wilderness. By total area, Canada is the second largest country in the world, surpassed only by Russia. Its territory stretches across 6 time zones, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific and deep into the Arctic North. The scale is difficult to grasp. But despite its enormous size, most Canadians live relatively close to the U.S. border, where the climate and transportation networks are more favorable. Large parts of the north remain sparsely inhabited due to harsh winters, geographic isolation, and difficult terrain. This contrast helped shape Canada's history. For centuries, distance and environment influenced trade, settlement, exploration, and communication across the country's immense territory. So while Canada is often imagined through its major cities, much of the country is still defined by scale, wilderness, and the challenge of living across one of the largest landscapes on Earth. Most Canadians live near the U.S. border. Despite Canada's enormous size, most of its population is concentrated in a surprisingly narrow southern corridor. Roughly 90% of Canadians live within about 160 kilometers of the United States border. This pattern developed over centuries for practical reasons. Southern Canada has milder climates, longer growing seasons, easier transportation routes, and closer access to major trade networks connected to the Great Lakes and the Atlantic coast. Meanwhile, much of northern Canada is dominated by forests, mountains, tundra, and Arctic conditions that make large-scale settlement difficult. Vast areas remain sparsely populated even today. As railways expanded and cities industrialized during the 19th and 20th centuries, major urban centers such as Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and Ottawa continued growing along this southern band. So while Canada appears massive on a map, most of its people live relatively close together, clustered near the border that shaped the country's economy, transportation, and history for generations. Indigenous history goes back thousands of years. Canada's history did not begin with European exploration. Long before Vikings, French settlers, or British colonies arrived, indigenous peoples had already lived across the region for thousands of years, building diverse societies adapted to vastly different environments. Archaeological evidence shows human presence in parts of northern Canada dating back many millennia, following migrations into the Americas during the last ice age. Over time, distinct nations and cultures developed across forests, plains, coastlines, and Arctic regions. These societies were not uniform. Indigenous peoples across the land spoke different languages, maintained separate political systems, trade networks, spiritual traditions, and ways of life shaped by geography and history. Some communities built large trade relationships across vast distances. Others developed deep knowledge of Arctic survival, fishing systems on the Pacific coast, or agricultural settlements in the woodlands of the East. European arrival did not introduce civilization to an empty land. It brought new empires into territories that were already inhabited, organized, and culturally rich long before recorded colonial history began. To understand Canada's story fully, its timeline has to begin thousands of years before the country itself existed. Canada has two official languages. Canada is one of the few countries in the world with two official languages at the federal level, English and French. This bilingual identity traces back to the country's colonial history, shaped by both French and British rule in North America. Even after Britain gained control of New France in the 18th century, large French-speaking populations remained, especially in Quebec. Over time, language became deeply tied to politics, identity, and national unity. Tensions between English-speaking and French-speaking communities influenced major debates throughout Canadian history, especially during the 19th and 20th centuries. In 1969, the federal government passed the Official Languages Act, formally recognizing English and French as equal languages within federal institutions. Today, bilingualism remains a central part of Canada's national identity. Federal services, parliamentary proceedings, and many public institutions operate in both languages, reflecting the country's dual linguistic heritage. But Canada's linguistic story is even broader than that. Alongside English and French are dozens of indigenous languages and the languages brought by generations of immigrants from around the world. So Canada's bilingualism is not just a policy. It reflects centuries of history, compromise, and the effort to hold together a country shaped by multiple cultural identities. The maple leaf flag is relatively new. Canada's iconic red and white flag feels timeless today, but it is much newer than many people assume. For much of its history, Canada did not have a unique national flag. Variations of British symbols, especially the Union Jack and later the Canadian Red Ensign, were commonly used to represent the country. As Canada's identity evolved during the 20th century, debates grew over whether the country should adopt a distinct national symbol separate from its colonial past. The discussion became politically intense, reflecting broader questions about independence, unity, and national identity. After years of debate, the modern maple leaf design was officially adopted on February 15, 1965. The new flag featured a single red maple leaf centered between two red bars, simple, recognizable, and uniquely Canadian. The maple leaf itself had already been associated with Canada for generations, appearing in military insignia, songs, and national imagery long before becoming the centerpiece of the flag. Today, the design is one of the most recognizable national flags in the world. But despite its global familiarity, Canada's most famous symbol is only a few decades old, created during a period when the country was redefining what it meant to be Canadian. Canada played a major role in the World Wars. When World War I began in 1914, Canada was still closely tied to the British Empire. As Britain entered the war, Canada was automatically drawn into the conflict. But over time, Canadian forces developed a reputation that gave the country growing international recognition of its own. More than 600,000 Canadians served during World War I, a massive number for a country with a relatively small population at the time. Canadian troops fought in major battles such as Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele, and the 100 Days Offensive. The Battle of Vimy Ridge in 1917 became especially important in Canadian memory because all 4 Canadian divisions fought together successfully under Canadian command. Many historians view it as a defining moment in the country's emerging national identity. Just over 2 decades later, Canada again entered global war. In World War II, Canadian forces participated in the Battle of the Atlantic, the Italian Campaign, the Normandy landings on D-Day, and the liberation of parts of Western Europe. The wars also transformed Canada internally, accelerating industrial growth, changing the economy, and increasing the country's independence on the world stage. So while Canada is often associated with peacekeeping and diplomacy today, its modern identity was deeply shaped by some of the largest wars in human history. Canada has more lakes than any other country. Canada's landscape is shaped by water on an almost unimaginable scale. The country contains more lakes than the rest of the world combined by some estimates, with millions of freshwater lakes spread across its vast territory. These lakes were largely formed by retreating glaciers at the end of the last ice age, which carved depressions into the land thousands of years ago. As the ice melted, enormous freshwater systems were left behind across what is now Canada. The scale is extraordinary. Canada contains a significant percentage of the world's freshwater reserves, including parts of the Great Lakes system, the largest group of freshwater lakes on Earth by surface area. For indigenous peoples, rivers and lakes served as transportation routes, food sources, and cultural lifelines long before European arrival. Later, explorers, traders, and settlers relied on these waterways to move across immense distances through forests and wilderness. Even today, water continues to shape Canadian geography, economy, and identity, from hydroelectric power to fishing, transportation, and tourism. So when people picture Canada's forests or snow-covered landscapes, they are also looking at one of the largest freshwater networks on Earth. The RCMP became a national symbol. Few Canadian institutions became as internationally recognizable as the Mounted Police. The organization that would eventually become the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, began in 1873 during a period when the Canadian government was expanding westward across the frontier. Originally called the Northwest Mounted Police, it was created to establish federal authority in newly acquired Western territories. At the time, Canada faced major challenges across the vast plains and frontier regions, regulating trade, responding to unrest, and asserting control over enormous distances with limited infrastructure. One of the force's most famous early events was the March West of 1874, when mounted officers traveled across difficult terrain to establish posts in the prairies. Over time, the image of red-coated riders on horseback became closely tied to Canada's national identity. In 1920, the organization officially became the Royal Canadian Mounted Police after merging with another federal policing service. The RCMP later gained worldwide recognition through films, tourism imagery, ceremonies, and popular culture, helping create the enduring image of the Canadian Mountie. But behind the symbol was a more complex frontier history, one connected to Western expansion, federal authority, and Canada's transformation into a continental nation. The red uniform became iconic. But it also represented the growing reach of the Canadian state across an immense and changing land. Canada once had a gold rush boom. In the late 19th century, news of gold discoveries triggered one of the most dramatic migrations in Canadian history. The most famous was the Klondike Gold Rush, which began in 1896 after gold was discovered near the Klondike River in the Yukon region. Within months, stories of sudden wealth spread across North America and beyond, drawing tens of thousands of prospectors toward the far north. Many traveled through harsh mountain passes and freezing wilderness in hopes of striking it rich. The journey itself became legendary, long, dangerous, and physically exhausting. Boomtowns appeared almost overnight. Dawson City, near the center of the gold fields, rapidly transformed from a remote settlement into a crowded frontier town filled with miners, merchants, saloons, and speculation. But like many gold rushes, the reality was harsher than the dream. Most prospectors never became wealthy, and many arrived too late to claim profitable land. Still, the gold rush permanently changed northern Canada. It accelerated settlement, increased government presence in the Yukon, and captured international attention at a time when much of the region remained isolated from the outside world. For many people, the Klondike symbolized adventure and opportunity. But behind the legends of gold and fortune was a difficult frontier shaped by extreme conditions, risk, and the relentless search for wealth at the edge of the Arctic world. Hockey became part of national identity. Few sports became as deeply connected to a country's identity as hockey did in Canada. The game evolved during the 19th century from earlier stick-and-ball sports played on ice, particularly in eastern Canada. By the late 1800s, organized indoor hockey games and formalized rules were already taking shape in cities like Montreal. Canada's long winters and frozen landscapes helped the sport spread naturally across towns and communities. Outdoor ponds, rivers, and local rinks became gathering places where hockey grew into both recreation and tradition. As the country expanded during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, hockey increasingly became tied to Canadian culture itself, crossing regional and linguistic divides in a rapidly changing nation. Professional leagues emerged, rivalries developed, and Canadian teams helped shape the modern game internationally. Moments like the Stanley Cup Finals and international tournaments eventually became major national events watched by millions. But hockey's cultural role went beyond sports. It became part of how many Canadians imagined themselves, resilient through winter, connected through community, and united by shared traditions stretching across a vast country. So while hockey began as a game on frozen ice, it gradually evolved into one of the defining symbols of Canadian identity itself. Canada has Arctic territory. A large part of Canada lies far beyond the forests and cities most people associate with the country. Canada extends deep into the Arctic, encompassing vast northern mainland regions and thousands of islands that reach toward the North Pole. This includes major Arctic territories such as Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and parts of Yukon. These northern lands include tundra, glaciers, frozen seas, and some of the most extreme environments on Earth. The Canadian Arctic archipelago alone contains some of the world's largest islands, including Baffin Island and Ellesmere Island, separated by icy channels that remained difficult to navigate for centuries. For thousands of years, Inuit communities adapted to this environment, developing knowledge of sea ice, wildlife migration, and survival in polar conditions long before southern governments mapped the region in detail. The Arctic also shaped Canada's political history. During the Age of Exploration, European expeditions searched these waters for the Northwest Passage, hoping to find a sea route linking the Atlantic and Pacific. Many voyages ended in hardship, including the famous Lost Expedition of Franklin Expedition. Today, the Arctic remains strategically important because of sovereignty, shipping routes, climate change, and natural resources. It is not just remote wilderness, it is central to Canada's geography and future. So while many picture Canada through Toronto or Montreal, a huge part of the country lies in the polar north, among ice, tundra, and one of the largest Arctic regions on Earth. The country is known for peacekeeping. Canada's international image became closely tied to peacekeeping, but that reputation was built gradually, not automatically. After the Second World War, Canada emerged with greater diplomatic influence than many expected. It was no longer just a former colony or middle power, it had become increasingly active in global negotiations and international institutions like the United Nations. A major turning point came during the Suez Crisis. In 1956, Canadian diplomat and Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson proposed a United Nations peacekeeping force to help reduce tensions after conflict erupted over the Suez Canal. The idea helped stabilize the crisis and earned Pearson the Nobel Peace Prize. From that point onward, Canada became strongly associated with UN peacekeeping missions during the Cold War, contributing personnel to operations in regions such as Cyprus, the Sinai, and the Balkans. The image of Canadian soldiers in blue UN helmets became part of the country's global identity. That reputation, however, sometimes oversimplifies history. Canada also remained a NATO member, maintained armed forces, and participated in combat operations when required. Peacekeeping became an important symbol, but not the whole story. Still, during the second half of the 20th century, diplomacy helped shape how the world saw Canada, as a country positioned between larger powers, often acting as mediator rather than aggressor. So while Canada had fought major wars before, its Cold War image became something different, a nation increasingly recognized for diplomacy, negotiation, and the politics of peace. Canada's economy was built on trade routes. Canada's economy did not begin with factories or cities, it began with routes across rivers, lakes, and wilderness. In the early colonial period, the fur trade became one of the most important economic foundations of what would become Canada. European demand for beaver pelts drove French and British traders deep into the interior, where vast networks of waterways connected distant regions. Hudson's Bay Company and Northwest Company became central to this system, establishing trading posts across the continent. But those routes depended heavily on indigenous knowledge, canoe travel, and existing trade connections that had existed long before Europeans arrived. The geography mattered. The St. Lawrence River, Great Lakes, and interior river systems acted as natural highways, allowing goods, people, and information to move across immense distances. These routes helped shape exploration, settlement, and political control. In the 19th century, another transportation revolution transformed the country: the railway. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway linked eastern Canada to the Pacific coast, making national expansion possible in practical terms, not just on maps. The railway accelerated migration, commerce, and industrial growth. It also helped bind together provinces separated by thousands of kilometers, making Confederation economically viable. So Canada's national economy was not built in one place. It grew through movement, along rivers first, then steel tracks, connecting remote frontiers into a single country across one of the largest landscapes on Earth. Canada's identity is constantly evolving. Canada is often presented as if its identity has always been fixed, but in reality, it has been changing for centuries. Modern Canada is the result of many historical layers. Indigenous civilizations that shaped the land long before colonization. French settlement along the St. Lawrence, British imperial rule, and later immigration from every part of the world. Each left lasting influences on language, politics, law, and culture. The country's identity was never formed in a single moment. It evolved through treaties, wars, migration, industrialization, and social change, often through debate over what Canada should become. Questions about language, regional autonomy, indigenous rights, and multiculturalism continue shaping that process today. French influence remains deeply rooted in places like Quebec City and Montreal. British political institutions shaped parliamentary government. Indigenous nations continue to influence law, land rights, and national conversations about history and reconciliation. Meanwhile, immigration transformed cities such as Toronto and Vancouver into some of the most culturally diverse urban centers in the world. That makes Canada difficult to define through a single story. It is not only British, not only French, not only a northern frontier, and not only a modern multicultural state. It is all of those layers at once. Which means Canada's story is not just about the past. It is still being written, shaped by each generation deciding what the country becomes next. Canada's history is far more layered than most people realize. Behind the familiar image of forests, snow, and quiet cities lies a much longer story, one shaped by indigenous civilizations, Viking voyages, empires, frontiers, war, migration, and constant change. What we call Canada today was not created in a single moment. It emerged over centuries, shaped by many peoples and many competing visions of what this land could become. And that story is still unfolding. Thank you for watching. If this gave you a new perspective on Canada's past, feel free to leave a comment and share which part surprised you most. If you enjoy exploring overlooked history, subscribe for more stories that go beyond the usual version of the past. And if you found this video worth your time, a like and share really helps the channel grow and makes it possible to keep creating more deep dives like this. Because some of the most interesting history is often hidden in places we think we already know.